person rather than simply tackling the ideas in and of themselves. But for the purposes at hand, Harvey quotes Marx's passage where he says, each society has its own laws of population that are particular to that society. There are no such things as transcendent universal laws of population. Those laws of population are a function of or reflection of the specific circumstances of a given society. And that's how we should think about population, is not as somehow dictated from some kind of removed transcendental point of view based on such a thing as the attraction between the sexes, but in fact specifically grounded in the relations of a given society, and those relations are structures or are structured in such a way that they are true, but we can't necessarily observe them directly. And value and labor, the labor theory of value, should be understood as specific to capitalist societies. And this, Harvey suggests, is a different way of proceeding, and a radically, the only way of proceeding that's adequate to the complexity of this question. Okay? He says most contemporary investigations of the population-resources relation recognize all of Marx's requirements save the last, and rely upon systems theory for their methodological foundations. Systems theoretic formulations are sophisticated enough in principle to do everything that Marx sought to do, except to transform concepts and categories dialectically, and therefore to transform the nature of the system from within. He wrote this 35 years ago, but it's actually still very accurate to this day. You think about the approaches of Daly and Costanza and Das Gupta. You think about ecosystem services and the debates around those. This is an accurate description of what those approaches do and don't do. They are systems theoretic. They assume that you can sort of bound the system, perhaps at a global scale, but nonetheless bound it. You can identify key variables, population being one of them, economic production being another one, natural resources, supplies of water, that kind of thing are others. And then you can manipulate those systems, model them, set up experiments, run data sets through them, and you can generate a system that has feedbacks and to that extent is dynamic. Right? You can model the depletion of water over time such that at some point you run into some kind of price spike, which in turn alters the way things are produced or causes wars. Who knows? But nonetheless, it's still a systems theory that lacks this dialectical moment in which the categories themselves change. The meaning of water changes. The meaning of a book changes. There is no internal dynamism. You sort of you hope to get the perfect model and run it, and you assume that that is adequate. You might think of climate models in this respect. Climate models are incredibly complex, and they're incredibly powerful. But they still assume that the categories you set up and input into them are stable and need not change. If you think about this in terms of population, the assumption is that population is a stable category, that you can quibble about exactly how well the numbers have been collected, but it is a variable that is categorically set. It is simply the number of people in a given place, and that need not change. Yeah?
So essentially it's a variable that's not kept into account in
the systems theory? The systems theories still work in a basically logical empirical kind of framework, or a modeling framework. They do not allow for, or they simply think of it this way. If the point is that ideas can themselves change the world, and that they reflect a changing world, and that the way we think about the world incorporates this dynamism and is a part of the system itself, then you can't concoct a system that incorporates that. You can't build a system that's nicely bounded and run all those variables and have the variables transform themselves internally, such that by the time you get to some point in the future, you have a different system altogether. Right? The basic building blocks of the system are fixed at the moment that you put it together, and that's what's lacking, is the potential for internal change through this interaction of the world and ideas, people in the world, people making decisions and taking actions and so forth. In other words, there can be no such a thing as internal dynamism other than that which is sort of built into the categories to begin with, right? The relationships of those categories. Now, I realize this is pretty esoteric stuff. The important conclusion, Harvey says, is that the method adopted and the nature of the result are integrally related. It is difficult to see how anything other than a relational, constructivist, and internally dynamic method can be appropriate for looking into the future of the population-resources relation, particularly when it is so evident that knowledge and understanding are such important mediating forces in the construction of that future. So the systems models are still basically assuming that there is a world out there that is objective, that our ability to think about it is measured by the sort of fit between our concepts and measurements and that objective world, and that is adequate to understanding these dynamics. But in fact, he's suggesting that gives up or ignores or brackets, it sort of assumes away the internal dynamism of a system of this degree of complexity. Did you have something?
Are there any examples of population outside the epistemological positivist method?
Are there examples of? There are plenty of examples, but they don't tend to be treated as scientific, right? I mean, you might think about Connolly's book. It's full of information, but it isn't trying to do the kind of modeling and prediction. It's simply recounting a story in which there's all kinds of dynamism. And it's actually about the construction of categories such as world population and the way that in turn feeds back and affects institutions and people and has all kinds of consequences. But he's not trying to do what we would call sort of scientific demography, right? And a lot of this comes back to the question of, what does science mean? And Harvey's conclusion, as I take it, is if you're interested in this problem, the standard definition of science is not helpful. Or rather, perhaps it's not adequate, right? It can be helpful in various ways, but it's not actually going to, you are fooling yourself if you think that these methods will give you purchase on this set of problems in some kind of unproblematic or predictable way. Yeah. Uh-huh. Would the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment scenarios count as examples of this? That's a very good question. On the one hand, they do obviously attempt to capture the unpredictability and the uncertainty associated with different futures, right? That's sort of what scenario planning, and that's the strength of scenario planning, is that it starts from the premise that we can't predict everything in sort of nice, clean, rock-solid, scientific certainty kind of fashion. On the other hand, I would suggest that they aren't in fact using this method to construct the pieces of their models in the first place, right? They are still collecting a sort of finite set of variables and diagramming or conceptualizing their relationships in sort of fixed ways. And I mean, but they also acknowledge that there's no telling, right? This is their attempt to sort of paint a variety of pictures to give a sense of the range of possibilities looking forward and perhaps concretize people's imaginations or visions of the future. But they're, I mean, the variables that perhaps matter the most are precisely the ones that they admit they can't predict, right? Changes in behavior, changes in technology, changes in knowledge, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Can this dynamism perhaps be understood through the lens of evolution of, say, like species, and how it's not known how the species will evolve to its changing environment, and in turn how that changing species will affect its environment, and there's no way.
Can we use evolution as an analog? Actually, I would suggest that that's an extremely good suggestion. And interestingly enough, Marx asked Darwin if he could dedicate capital to him, right? Marx thought of Darwin as embodying this kind of dialectical approach, or rather instantiating it, using it with respect to natural history. Marx said of Capital, the book, that it was an account of political economy that was analogous to Darwin's account of evolution. And that internal dynamism in which things, organisms evolve, environments change, organisms affect environments, environments affect organisms, and you get ongoing change that can't be predicted, but does follow certain kinds of laws. We can describe the mechanisms and we can understand them, even though we can't predict what the outcome will be. So that is a very good example, I think. Now, relating this back to Conley, Harvey makes these claims towards the end of his essay. Whenever a theory of overpopulation seizes hold in a society dominated by an elite, then the non-elite invariably experience some form of political, economic, or social repression. If, for whatever reason, an elite group requires an argument to support policies of repression, then the overpopulation argument is most beautifully tailored to fit this purpose. Obviously, in Malthus's day, the non-elite that Harvey has in mind would be the working class, or the peasantry, perhaps. In the context of Conley's book, the non-elite would be the mothers and fathers, or potential mothers and fathers of the global South, traced through the effects or the implementation of various population control programs after World War II. This graph, which is in an earlier chapter, depicts the increasing funding, especially United Nations funding after 1966. Conley says in the chapter that I asked you to read for last week, divided from within and besieged from without, leaders created a system without a brain, setting in motion agencies and processes that could not be stopped. The idea of a population crisis provided the catalyst, but this was a system that ran on money. Earmarked appropriations greased the wheels of bulky bureaucracies, and lavish funding was the fuel that drove it forward. But so much poured in so fast that spending became an end unto itself. Partly by default, partly by design, donors were creating something completely new in the development field, a system to recycle money through international and non-governmental organizations that, unlike the US or even Sweden, could claim to work on behalf of all humanity. So here we see the construction, first, of a concept of global population, from it, a crisis that has to be addressed at the global scale because that's the scale at which the problem has been defined. And it goes in search of a way of legitimating itself as work on behalf of all humanity. If the money was seen as US money or Swedish money, that was in and of itself a threat to its legitimacy because it would look like it must reflect the interests and ambitions of the US government. And there was therefore a need to create institutions that looked like they were transcendent or universal, detached from the particularistic interests of any government, and simply acting on behalf of humanity as a whole. These are from the chapter for last week, depicting the increase in funding, this time from 71 to 77 from various sources. These are national aid agencies, the US and Sweden, Norway, and Japan. These are international entities and NGOs, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the International Planned Parenthood Foundation, and the United Nations Fund for Population, what's A stand for? I can't remember. And you see this radical increase in funding over a short period of time. And then he shows this graph depicting the spikes in the number of people receiving vasectomies and tubectomies in relation to changes in the amount of incentive payments made to individuals for this, right? And it would appear quite clear that the way that people were induced to get their tubes tied or to get vasectomies was directly related to how much money they would be paid for it. This being, again, the system without a brain, looking to use up all this money that these organizations were receiving, and to show results, in this case, in terms of people sterilized. And the peak here of 8 million people sterilized in India in 1975-76 represents, according to Conley, both the high point and essentially the end of the global struggle to control world population. This was implemented, if you remember, under conditions of essentially martial law. Right? The democratic government of India was suspended, and these programs were implemented on these vast scales, essentially with no accountability, in the name of humanity, but obviously having a very, very lopsided effect in terms of who suffered. Right? These quotations from the book struck me as relevant to Harvey's argument. The situation is almost like the links of a food chain. The personally led special purpose foundations experiment for and nourish the larger and more deeply institutionalized foundations and universities. These in turn experiment for and nourish the governments, which now show signs of experimenting for and nourishing the international organizations. The same activity, which is viewed as improper, if not downright wicked, at the beginning of the chain, is transformed by the end into an essential constituent of virtue, if not a basic human right. So forcibly vasectomizing or sterilizing people or doing it under conditions of duress starts out looking like a wicked activity, but by the time it has worked its way through these institutional links, which both launder the money and give the appearance of sort of sanitizing the interests involved, you end up with a completely different outcome at the end. And then finally, Kingsley Davis, quoted here, remarking on the necessary conditions for the effective implementation of these kinds of policies, for effectively addressing world population. He says, in short, the likely way the massive urbanization projected for Asia can take place is by a totalitarian government, highly competent and rigorously committed, ruling a docile mass of semi-educated but thoroughly indoctrinated urbanites, existing at a low level of consumption, working very hard, and accepting passively what is provided for them. This is the kind of conclusion that seems unavoidable, given this system without a brain and given the way that the problem was constructed in the first place. The notion of a global population translated into these global threats, global crisis that was more urgent than nuclear war itself, according to some of the people involved in it, leads to these kinds of, an absolute loss of ethical compass, perhaps, is the best way of putting it. And Hardin, presumably, would totally agree with this. Whatever has to be done to limit population growth is ethical, according to Hardin. And here it is translated into the sort of global political economy of the 1970s. All right, I feel like the second half of this lecture is still somewhat disjointedly related to the first half. If you have questions or thoughts or need clarification on something, we have a few minutes left. No? Yes.
So this second part showing how the method that was done using two domains is like you explained earlier.
Well, I see this as an empirical illustration of Harvey's claim that any theory of overpopulation will necessitate the persecution of the non-elite or some kind of repression. I also see this as a nice illustration of the inherently ideological nature of the production of scientific knowledge in certain ways, right? And in fact, it was only by clothing these arguments in terms of scientific truth that the legitimacy of these programs could be foisted off on even the first line of resistors, right? In other words, this type of program and this type of unethical mass treatment could not have been possible if the knowledge on which these claims were based was not viewed as somehow objective, right? Sort of cleansing an argument about population of its potential ideological contents, right, is sort of the story of Connolly's book, right? Over and over and over again, elite people, particularly in the United States, got concerned about world population, and in pushing forward their agenda, they again and again and again had to fend off suspicions of racism, suspicions of ulterior motives that would otherwise cripple them. And the production of objective demographic knowledge about the world's population and then claims about the impacts that would follow from it was critical to enabling this to take on the forms that it did. All right, so for next time, read Amartya Sen and finish the last 14 pages of Connolly, and we will see you on Thursday.